The Vraathi had a word for the way a river bends before it falls. I learned it later, after all of it was over, from the Conclave's own liturgical texts, the ones the High Docent released as a gesture of what he called corrected understanding. The word was something like Vraathi, and it meant the moment a thing changes its nature without changing its course. The river is still going where it was always going, but everything downstream is different now. I was executive officer of the diplomatic frigate Lisbon on the morning humanity's river bent. I want to be precise about the morning because imprecision has crept into the record over the years and I have watched it calcify into mythology. We were not there to provoke. We were not there to demonstrate anything. The Lisbon was a Category 2 diplomatic vessel, lightly armed by doctrine, crewed by 41 people, carrying a 3-person civilian attaché led by Ambassador Sun Akafer. We had been in transit for 11 weeks from the Uveth relay post, crossing the deep nothing between the Cassid Arm and the outer boundary of Vraathi sovereign space, and in all that time, we had done nothing more threatening than maintain our assigned heading and answer the Conclave's directional queries with the correct coded responses. The Vraathi called these queries sounding the approach, which is apt. They sent low-frequency pulses at geometrically precise intervals, and the correct diplomatic response was silence for 3 pulses, then a single mirrored return on the 4th. We did this for the full 11 weeks, every 4 days. Silence, 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 echo. It was their way of measuring whether you understood the shape of their attention, whether you had read the liturgy closely enough to speak it back correctly. Ambassador Akafer had been emphatic with the crew before departure. You do not improvise with the Vraathi. You do not add anything. You do not subtract anything. You answer exactly as the liturgy prescribes, because the liturgy is how the conclave decides whether you are a creature worth speaking to or a creature worth silencing. 41 people, 11 weeks, not a single improvisation. I was proud of that. The crew of the Lisbon was not, by any military measure, a special crew. Our engineer, Chief Petty Officer Don M. Wohl, was 2 years from retirement and had spent most of the transit refining a crossword puzzle system he invented around week 4, filling composition notebooks with grids and clues, and occasionally holding seminars in the crew compartment that 3 people attended out of genuine interest, and 5 attended because there was very little else to do. Our communications officer, Ensign Rail Fortis, had graduated from the Cassid Arm Naval Academy 8 months before departure. This was his first deep space posting. He was good at his job in the watchful, careful way that young officers are good when they understand the consequences of error. Our navigator, Lieutenant Commander Yui Tanaka, was quiet and precise, and could calculate a Uveth prime shadow entry window in her head to 3 decimal places, which I considered adequate compensation for the fact that she did not drink coffee, and therefore could not sympathize with my ongoing difficulties with the galley machine. Our senior medic, Petty Officer Rin Kalvar, had served on 3 previous outer-arm postings and possessed a clinical calm that made her the most useful person aboard in situations involving either physical injury or rising crew anxiety. The Lisbon was not a ship that bred heroes. It was a ship that bred competence, and in my years at sea, if you will permit the old metaphor in a context where sea means the deep between the stars, I had come to value competence over heroism at roughly the same ratio that I valued a reliable engine over a fast one. Captain Marin Dahl ran a quiet ship. She was compact, gray-haired, with the kind of considered stillness that comes from long experience combined with having made peace with the worst possible outcomes early in your career. She had commanded vessels for 22 years. Before taking the Lisbon, she had commanded a patrol destroyer on the outer Cassid routes, the sort of posting that teaches you everything important about patience and very little about glory. It had shaped her the way long, slow passages shape everything, deliberately, without announcement, into exactly what the work required. She spoke rarely and said the things she meant, and I had never once seen her revise a position under pressure, only under evidence. I had served under 3 commanding officers before Dahl. I would have followed her anywhere without hesitation, and without needing to be told why. We crossed the outer marker at 4:12 hours, ship's time, on the 47th day of transit from the Uveth relay. The marker was a cold, unremarkable navigational buoy that the Vraathi had seated at the edge of their claimed space 300 years ago, before humanity had learned to build the kind of ships that could reach it. I logged the crossing in the same flat language I used for everything. Outer boundary marker Uveth 7 confirmed, course unchanged, status nominal. Then I went down to the galley and poured a cup of bad coffee and stood at the narrow port window that nobody else ever seemed to use and watched the dark. The dark out there was particular. We were running in the gas giant's shadow, Uveth Prime, a bruised amber giant at the deep edge of the outer system, its cloud bands layered in rust and ochre that looked almost organic when the star's light caught the upper atmosphere at the right angle. We were running in that shadow deliberately. The Conclave's liturgy specified that a diplomatic vessel should approach through Uveth Prime's shadow as an act of deference. It was how prey animals moved through the Vraathi's ancestral hunting grounds, low and slow, staying in the darkness where their predator-evolved hosts preferred to watch them. Akafir had been clear on this from the first briefing. We were guests in their cosmology. We would behave accordingly. So we were dark, and we were slow, and we were small, and the Lisbon's mass registered on Vraathi sensors as politely negligible. I had stood at this port window on every watch since we entered the approach corridor, most mornings with that cup of bad coffee, watching the gas giant's amber light reflect off nothing much and thinking about what was ahead. The Vraathi Conclave was one of the oldest continuous civilizations in this sector of the arm. Their culture was liturgical in the deepest sense, not ceremonial in the decorative way, but liturgical in the structural way, meaning that ritual was the load-bearing architecture of everything they did, from fleet doctrine to diplomatic protocol too. According to some of the anthropological material I had read during the transit, the way they classified weather. The liturgy was not a formality to the conclave. The liturgy was how they thought. This made them predictable in some ways and very difficult in others. Their behavior during the 11-week approach had been exactly what the briefing documents described. Sensor pulses on schedule, without variation. Directional queries formulaic to the word. They had not deviated by so much as a timing interval from the liturgical script, which told me either that they were satisfied with our responses, or that they were reserving judgment for the formal contact period. I suspected the latter. Vraathi doctrine held that you did not render a verdict until you had seen the full offering. The 11 weeks were the approach. The formal contact was the offering. I spent a good portion of those 11 weeks reading. I packed more material than strictly necessary for a diplomatic vessel XO assignment, and I worked through most of it during the transit. The anthropological analyses, the military doctrine studies, the cultural surveys, the 2 full translations of the Book of the Deep Passage that existed in the open literature, the intelligence summaries at my classification level and several that had found their way into general distribution through the kind of clerical generosity that happens when relay post librarians have been at the same posting for too many years. I read all of it with the particular attention. I gave things I expected to be examined on under conditions I could not predict. The concept that stayed with me was the Sothran, the revealed truth of our nature. The Conclave's doctrine of honest display at first contact. Show everything, hold nothing back, because what you withhold is what the other party will fill in with their fears, and their fears will be worse than your truth. It was a sophisticated doctrine for a species that had survived by being the apex predator in their original environment. Predators who survived long enough learned that the display of capability is more efficient than its exercise. You showed what you were. The other party made a calculation. Most calculations ended without violence. I found this admirable, reading alone in the transit dark. There was an honesty in it. Show the 18 warships. Let the other party know exactly what they are meeting. Then wait and see what they do with that knowledge. It did not occur to me in those weeks of reading to ask what humanity's equivalent of the Sothran might look like. What we would show, if we were the ones choosing what to reveal. I thought I was the one being shown to. I was wrong about that. I just did not know it yet. There were 43 other species in the surveyed outer arm. I had read files on most of them during the transit. The Vraathi were not the largest or the oldest, but they were the most comprehensively documented from the human side, because they had been the most consistent in their response to vessels that crossed their outer markers without the correct liturgical responses. In the 60 years since human ships had first reached the Kassid Arm's outer edge, 31 vessels had crossed the Vraathi boundary zone and failed the sounding the approach protocol. 27 of those vessels had been destroyed. The other 4 had been permitted to withdraw under the mercy of ignorance provision, the liturgical allowance for creatures who had not yet read the text. Humanity had read the text. 11 weeks of correct responses was the proof. But there is a difference between passing a test and understanding the subject it tests. The liturgy was not a password. It was a language, and like any language, it carried meaning in the spaces between its words as much as in the words themselves. The correct interval between silence and echo was not just a timing requirement. It was a statement about the kind of attention you were paying to the thing you were approaching. Akafer understood this. She spent 11 weeks watching every transmitted response the way a careful editor works through a draft, reading our own signals as the Vraathi might read them, looking for anything that said something she had not intended to say. My own opinion, kept out of the official record in the correct practice, was that we were doing something that would matter. I did not know in what way, but I knew we were doing it correctly, and that doing difficult things correctly is the closest thing I know to a guarantee of anything. There were 43 other species in the surveyed outer arm. I had read files on most of them during the transit, the way a traveler reads maps of a country they are about to enter. The Vraathi were not the largest or the oldest. The Pelhari Convergence held both those titles with a patience born of scale, but they were the most comprehensively documented from the human side, because they had been the most consistent in their hostility toward any vessel that crossed their outer markers without the correct liturgical responses. In the 60 years since human ships had first reached the Kassid Arm's outer edge, 31 vessels had crossed the Vraathi boundary zone and failed to respond correctly to the sounding the approach pulses. 27 of those vessels had been destroyed. The other 4 had been permitted to withdraw under what the Conclave called the mercy of ignorance provision, the liturgical allowance for creatures who had not yet read the text. Humanity had read the text. 11 weeks of correct responses was the proof. But there is a difference between passing a test and understanding the subject it tests, and I thought about that distinction often during the transit. The liturgy was not a password. It was not a gate with a combination. It was a language, and like any language it carried meaning in the spaces between its words as much as in the words themselves. The correct interval between silence and echo was not just a timing requirement. It was a statement about the kind of attention you were paying to the thing you were approaching. You could answer correctly and still not understand what the correct answer meant. Ambassador Akafer understood this, which was why she had spent 11 weeks watching every transmitted response with the same careful attention she gave the initial encoding, reading her own signals the way the Vraathi might read them, looking for anything that said something she had not intended to say. I had watched her do this in the evenings in the ship's small conference compartment, her tablet in her lap, the sensor log on the table beside it, working through the day's exchanges the way a careful editor works through a draft. She never said she was worried. She never said she was confident. She said, when I asked her once in the 3rd week of transit how she thought the approach was going, that it was going correctly, which was the only answer she was able to give, and the only answer that mattered. I respected that precision. I used the same approach in my own work. The log entries I wrote during those 11 weeks were not long. They were not reflective. They said what happened, in what order, at what time, in language that would give a reader in some future year the clearest possible picture of what the Lisbon had done and when it had done it. I left my opinions out of the official record, which is the correct practice, and I kept them in my own thinking, which is unavoidable. My opinion in those 11 weeks was that we were doing something that would matter. I did not know in what way. I did not know what we would find on the other side of the liturgical approach, or whether the Vraathi High Docent would accept our formal contact, or turn us away under some provision of the liturgy that Akafer's research had not uncovered. But I knew that we were doing it correctly, and that doing difficult things correctly, in the precise and careful way the difficulty deserves, is the closest thing I know to a guarantee of anything. It is not a guarantee of success. It is a guarantee that whatever happens, you will have been what the moment required. That thought stayed with me, along with the bad coffee and the amber light of the gas giant, and the silence of 41 people doing their jobs in the dark. At 7:11 hours I was at my station when Lieutenant Kendra Solis, our sensor operator, said, in the same level voice she used for everything, which was one of the things I valued most about her, "Commander, I'm reading the Conclave formation at bearing 227, range approximately 400,000 kilometers. They're broadcasting the ceremonial array signal." Dahl was already on the bridge, as she had been since 500. "Put it on visual, Lieutenant." The forward array came to full magnification. The Conclave formation resolved on the main screen as a cluster of identifiable hulls, because the Vraathi wanted to be seen. 3 wings of 6 warships formed a triangle approximately 200 kilometers across, with the flagship at the apex. The Vraathi, the first truth, or the oldest word, depending on how you parse the liturgical syntax, was perhaps 900 meters in length, its flanks carrying the ritual banding of deep crimson and pale gold that marked a vessel of doctrinal significance. The other 17 ships were smaller but followed the same design language. Organic curves, layered hull sections, the kind of profile that looks less like something built and more like something that grew into its shape over a long time, guided by requirements that were not primarily aesthetic. I had read descriptions of the Sothran in the briefing documents. Seeing it on the sensor screen was different. There is always a gap between the written word and the resolved contact, and in that gap lives a species of understanding the documents cannot provide. I understood, looking at those 18 ships, why the Vraathi liturgy required this display. It was not posturing. It was clarity. Show everything. Let the other party make their calculation. It was, in its way, an act of respect. I counted the ships one more time, wrote 2 sentences in the log, and poured another cup of bad coffee that the machine produced with its customary indifference to my preferences. "Signal from the Vraathi," Solis said. "Liturgical greeting, standard diplomatic variant, requesting formal acknowledgement." Dahl looked at me. I nodded. "Ambassador Akafer to the bridge," she said over the comm. Akafer arrived in under 4 minutes. She was perhaps 60, tall, deliberate in all her movements, with the quality of attention I had learned to associate with people who had spent careers in rooms where the wrong word cost lives. She looked at the formation on the screen for perhaps 3 seconds, not 1 second less than she needed, not one more. "That's the full Sothran," she said. "Yes, Ambassador." 18 ships, they didn't hold anything back. "No." She set the ceremonial packet on the navigation console and opened it with careful hands. "Then they're taking us seriously." She lifted the first element, a thin disk of pressed ceramic, etched with the response glyph she had prepared months before departure, and held it out to Solis. "Encode the acknowledgement glyph sequence and transmit on the liturgical band. Steady output, no modulation." Solis encoded and transmitted. There was a silence of approximately 40 seconds. Then the Vraathi responded with the Sothran complete signal. All 18 warships lighting their secondary running arrays in a choreographed sequence, a ripple of pale gold that moved through the formation from apex to base. It was, according to everything I had read, the formal bow. "They acknowledge us," Akafor said. "We are now in the liturgical period, 4 hours exactly as prescribed. At the end of 4 hours, the Vraathi will transmit the invitation signal, and we move to the designated meeting point at the specified speed. Nothing improvised. Nothing added." She looked around the bridge. "We hold." 4 hours. We held position in the gas giant shadow while 18 Vraathi warships held the Sothran and watched us with sensors I could only partially read. The Vraathi used electromagnetic methods in combination with what our technical staff called acoustic analog, low-frequency vibrations transmitted through local space in a way that required receivers we did not fully understand, which meant a portion of their sensor picture was invisible to us. We knew they were reading us. We did not know everything they were seeing. This did not trouble me as much as it might have, because there was nothing aboard the Lisbon we were hiding. 41 people in a lightly armed diplomatic vessel, voluntarily running dark in their ceremonial approach shadow. If the Conclave wanted to read us, they were welcome to. We were showing them in our own way exactly what we were. I spent part of those 4 hours walking the ship. This was something I did on long watches, and the crew had long since stopped noticing. I walked from the bridge through the crew compartments, through the engineers section where M. Wohl was running a systems diagnostic with the focused attention of a man who had decided machines were more reliable than people and organized his professional life accordingly. I walked through the communications compartment where Fortis was monitoring the Vraathi channels with the careful alertness of a junior officer who understood the weight of what he was sitting beside. I walked through the diplomatic quarters, where Akafor's 2 attachés were finalizing the contact materials with the methodical calm of people who had done their preparation and had faith in the work. 41 people, all of them doing exactly what they had been asked to do. I noted this, walking back to the bridge, not because it was unusual, but because it was the opposite of unusual, and the ordinary competence of ordinary people at difficult moments is something the record tends to overlook in favor of dramatic gestures. Dramatic gestures come later if they come at all. Ordinary competence over 11 weeks of transit and 4 hours of a holding period is what makes the later moments possible. At 11:13 hours, 3 hours and 2 minutes into the liturgical period, Solis said, in the same level voice she used for everything, "Commander, I'm reading a secondary mass contact. Deep shadow, bearing 143, range approximately 800 meters off our port stern." I turned, "Clarify secondary mass contact." "Large vessel," Solis said. "Very large, thermal output consistent with cold drives at startup. Electromagnetic signature suppressed, but incomplete suppression. I'm reading residual field bleed consistent with a Class 8 or 9 mass profile." She paused. "Range is 800 meters. 800 meters. I looked at Dahl. Her face had not changed. "Time to full drive power?" she asked. Impossible to say without the full signature. Given the thermal curve, 4 minutes, possibly less. I looked at the forward screen. The Vraathi Sothran was still visible, steady, holding. The 18 warships had not changed their configuration. Whatever their sensors could read, and given the acoustic analog capability, I suspected considerably more than we could, they were not reacting to what was behind us. Not yet. I looked at the forward screen for approximately 4 seconds before I moved. In those 4 seconds I registered the following. The Vraathi formation had shifted, which I could see. The Vraathi were running a new sensor configuration, which Solis could read, and what was behind us was waking up, which we could feel in the sensor returns but not yet see. In those 4 seconds I also registered something that I have thought about many times since, which was this: I was not afraid. I should perhaps have been. There was an 800-meter profile of an unknown vessel, a potentially very large vessel, waking up behind me at the edge of the approach corridor for one of the most sensitive diplomatic contacts in the Outer Arm's recent history, and I was not afraid. I was attentive. I think the distinction matters. Fear and attention are often confused with each other because they look similar from the outside. Both make you still, both sharpen your focus, both suppress the peripheral details and leave you with the essential ones. But they are different from the inside. Fear is reactive. It is the body's response to a threat it has already assessed and found dangerous. Attention is responsive. It is the mind's engagement with a situation that it has not yet fully understood and is working to understand. Fear wants to run or fight. Attention wants to know. I wanted to know. I had been wanting to know for 11 weeks, in the patient way that the transit dark imposes on you when there is nothing to do but wait and read and think. And now something was happening, and my whole attention was on it, and I was still, the way you are still when you are not preparing to react but preparing to understand. I reached for the ship's log. I keyed the ship's log and began speaking in a low, steady voice. I do not know exactly why I did that at that moment. It was not regulation. It was not ordered. I simply felt that whatever was about to happen deserved to be witnessed precisely, and that the most useful thing I could do with my hands while I waited was record. Ship's log supplemental. Commander Ilara Voss, XO Lisbon, 11:13 hours. We are reading a large mass contact at close bearing, port stern, consistent with a cloaked vessel at cold drive startup. Range approximately 800 meters. Vraathi formation has not altered configuration. We are in the liturgical holding period, 4 minutes before the scheduled invitation signal. We are maintaining position. Drives nominal. All stations normal. Waiting. I closed the log channel. Dahl had not moved from her chair. She was looking at the forward screen with the expression she wore when she was doing arithmetic. "Ambassador," she said. Akafor stepped forward from near the navigation console. She had heard Solis's report. She was standing very still. "The Vraathi are going to hear it," Akafor said. "Not a question." "They may already," Dahl said. "Their acoustic analog array would pick up drive startup vibration before we can read it ourselves." "Will they understand what it is?" 3 seconds of silence. "That," said Captain Dahl, "is the question." At 11:17 hours, Solis said, "Contact is resolving. Drive power at approximately 30% and climbing. I'm reading full electromagnetic signature now. Class 9.2 mass profile." She looked up from her console. "Commander, it's a Morvath class DN. She's running her main array." "Range 812 meters port stern. She has not moved position. She is powering up in place." "Signal?" "None, she is simply on." I need to tell you what the Karev was, because the record that grew up around her afterward tends toward the mythological, and mythology never serves precision. The TES Karev was a Morvath-class deep void dreadnought, hull classification DN7. Commissioned 14 years before this posting, launched from the Praxis orbital yards in the Cassid Arm with a crew of 1,140. In the 14 years since commissioning, she had done what Morvath-class vessels were designed to do: exist in deep space, at very long range, for extended durations, in a state of readiness that Fleet Command's doctrine called persistent strategic presence. This was a bureaucratic phrase. What it meant was this: the Karev could run silent, cold, and still for a very long time. Her cloak was not the energy-expensive shimmer field that smaller vessels used, which generated thermal and electromagnetic signatures a sufficiently sensitive array could read at moderate range. The Karev's cloak was a mass displacement system. She sat inside a distortion envelope that bent sensor returns around her, and in that envelope she was, to any instrument we knew how to build. Not there. She had been not there for 63 days. I learned this later. At 11:17 hours I knew only what Solis was reading. 800 meters, port stern, cold drives at startup, mass consistent with Class 9 or above. Class 9 or above in TES nomenclature meant a vessel displacing more than 1.2 million metric tons. The Lisbon displaced 14,000. Understand the geometry. 41 people in a diplomatic frigate, voluntarily dark, in the approach shadow of a gas giant. 400,000 kilometers from 18 alien warships whose full attention was fixed on us. Behind us, at a distance slightly greater than the length of a city block, a 2-kilometer warship massing more than 80 Lisbons was waking up. We had not known she was there. That was the point. The Karev had been running cold and silent for 63 days, holding position in a specific region of Uveth Prime's shadow calculated to be masked by a particular interference node in the giant's electromagnetic wake. She had followed us from Uveth Station without our knowledge. She had positioned herself specifically to be at her closest possible bearing to the Vraathi flagship at the moment of formal diplomatic contact, not to threaten, not to posture, but to be present, to be real, to be seen or not seen as she chose. 63 days in the dark, 1,140 people silent. The Karev's commander, Senior Captain Ro Essendon, had filed his operational brief with Fleet Command before departure, and Fleet Command had forwarded a sealed summary to Dahl, which she had logged and filed. I had not been privy to the brief. Neither had Akafor. This was deliberate. Dahl had explained it to me before departure. If you don't know it, you can't transmit it, and if you can't transmit it, neither can they. The Vraathi might read electromagnetic signals we weren't aware we were emitting. Better that the Lisbon's crew simply not know the full picture. It would keep our emissions clean. So I had crossed 11 weeks of deep space in the genuine belief that we were 41 people carrying a mission alone. We were not alone. The Karev's weapons array, 12 siege-grade mass drivers, each capable of delivering a kinetic round with an impact force exceeding the combined yield of every weapon system on every ship in the Vraathi Southern formation. Secondary armament sufficient to engage and destroy all 18 warships simultaneously. A point defense suite that Fleet Command's own technical documents described as capable of denying a combined arms strike package from any currently catalogued non-Terran military force. The Vraathi were reading all of that now, their full-spectrum active scan sweeping across a hull profile that had not existed in their files 60 seconds ago. Their military intelligence had a file on every species that had ever approached the Conclave's outer markers. That file told them what the thing was. It did not tell them how long it had been sitting there, or what it meant that it had been sitting there that long. Those two facts were still ahead of them. At 11:19 hours, the Vraathi running arrays shifted from deep cold blue to something I had no color word for, a compressed violet, dark at the edges, that pulsed twice and then held steady. Solis checked her reference library. "I don't have a designator for that configuration," she said. "It's not in any signals intelligence we were given." Ambassador Dahl said. Akafor stepped to Solis' station and studied the display. "It's not in the diplomatic briefings either." A pause. "Though I have a context from the liturgical texts, the compressed violet with the double pulse, there is an entry in the Book of the Deep Passage that describes the running configuration of the flagship at the moment the first Vraathi explorer vessels encountered the Keth." I knew the Keth. Every diplomat in the outer arm knew the Keth, the only civilization in the documented history of this sector that had ever made the Vraathi Conclave retreat. "What happened at that encounter?" Dahl asked. "The Vraathi retreated, re-entered their own sovereign space, sealed the outer markers, and did not emerge for 40 years. A quiet moment on the bridge. "How large were the Keth vessels?" I asked. comparable to the Morvath class from what we can reconstruct. Akafor turned from the screen. The Conclave had no doctrine for something that size. When you have no framework, the liturgy says you withdraw until you can build one. I watched the Vraathi formation on the forward screen. It had not broken. 18 warships, facing a sensor return that had just rewritten their understanding of what was standing 800 meters behind the small diplomatic vessel they had spent 11 weeks reading, and they held. Their formation widened into Vraathi Conclave, the combat assessment posture, not the committed posture. They held their discipline. The Conclave's armadas had been fighting wars since before humanity had built its first orbital station. Their fleet doctrine was the accumulated product of several thousand years of survival and expansion. They held, and the holding was itself a statement. We are not panicking. We are reading. But the Vraathina's flagship array was broadcasting the compressed violet of a thing that had encountered something larger than its doctrine. I watched the Vraathi formation hold and thought about what that holding cost them. The liturgy gave them the permission to withdraw. The whole machinery of the Book of the Deep Passage was built around the legitimacy of retreat in the face of the genuinely unknown. No Vraathi commander had ever been shamed for invoking the recognition pause entitlement or the full tactical withdrawal that the Keth encounter had codified into doctrine. You withdrew when your doctrine had not priced in the thing in front of you. You re-entered your own space. You thought. You built a new framework. Then you emerged and dealt with the world as it actually was. Althu was not withdrawing. He was choosing to stay in the contact corridor with something he had no framework for, and to sit with the discomfort of that absence of framework rather than remove himself from it. The compressed violet meant, I am encountering something that does not fit my current understanding, and I am choosing to remain in its presence long enough to build new understanding. That was a significant choice for a high docent of the Vraathi Conclave. His entire professional life had been built around the assumption that the liturgy and doctrine he had inherited were sufficient to meet whatever the universe might send across the boundary. The Karev was evidence that they were not sufficient. Insufficient doctrine in the Vraathi framework was not a reason to retreat. It was a reason to correct. He was correcting in real time with 18 warships under his authority in the shadow of a gas giant, with a 2-kilometer human dreadnought 800 meters from his flagship's port bow. I have met a great many serious people in my career. I count Althu among the most serious. At 11:21 hours, the Karev transmitted. Not to us, not to the Lisbon, to the Vraathina on the Vraathi diplomatic band in the Vraathi liturgical signal format, not the full ceremony, not the Sothran response, but the pre-liturgical contact signal. 3 pulses, standard diplomatic variant, precisely the correct interval and modulation. The equivalent of a voice saying, simply and without further elaboration, I am here. That was all. The Vraathina did not respond for 41 seconds. I counted every one of them with the part of my mind that counts things automatically during silences in which something important is being decided. Then the flagship responded with the same signal, 3 pulses, I am here. The Karev did not transmit again. I wrote 6 words in the ship's log at 11:23 hours. No shots fired, formation holding, waiting. I wrote them, read them, decided they were sufficient and closed the channel. The liturgical period had expired at 11:13 hours. We were 10 minutes past it, and the invitation signal had not come. An expired liturgical period without the invitation signal meant, under Vraathi protocol, that the contact had been suspended. A suspended contact could mean several things, of which the most significant was what the liturgy called the recognition pause. The period a conclave armada was permitted to take when it encountered something requiring reclassification before proceeding. We were in a recognition pause. I thought about what it meant to be reclassified. The Vraathi had come to this contact with a picture of humanity assembled over 40 years from long-range sensor returns, intercepted communications, and careful analysis of everything humanity had sent through its outer marker exchanges, all the diplomatic pulses, the silent Sandeco responses, the correctly formatted liturgical acknowledgments. They had built a file, a thorough file. That file had described, in whatever the Vraathi equivalent of bureaucratic language was, a species that was communicative, methodical, and based on the mass profile of the diplomatic vessel they sent to first contact, appropriately modest in its reach. 41 people, 14,000 metric tons, one ceramic disc with the correct glyphs. That was the tributary, that was the edge of the river. The Karev was the river. I thought about this during the recognition pause, in the way you think about something you are not quite able to look at directly yet. There is a kind of understanding that arrives in pieces, the way light arrives in a room where the shutters are being opened one at a time, and each new slat of light makes the room slightly more visible, but also slightly more strange, because the darkness you have been sitting in for 11 weeks was at least a known quantity, and the light reveals that the room is larger than you thought it was. The Karev was that kind of light. I had been sitting in the comfortable darkness of believing myself part of a 41-person mission. The Karev's drives had opened the first slat. I thought about the 63 days, not in terms of the operational calculation. I understood why it was 63 days, why the position had been chosen, why the timing had been what it was. I understood the logic of it. What I was still working to understand was the experience of it. 1,140 people, cold and still, in a 2-kilometer hull, following a diplomatic frigate they had not been introduced to, maintaining a cloaked discipline over a period of time that most human vessels could not have sustained without at least a partial drive event that would have shown on a sensitive enough array. The people who had planned this had calculated not just the geometry and the timing, but the human endurance required to make it work. They had calculated Essendon, and they had been right about him. What does a patient thing look like from the outside? The Vraathi were learning that now, in real time, on the other side of this recognition pause. They were learning that a patient thing looks like nothing at all, for as long as it chooses, and then it looks like everything at once. It does not announce the change. It simply is, and then it is more, without apology and without ceremony, because the change was always coming and the timing was always up to the patient thing, and not to the thing it was waiting for. The recognition pause held. The minutes of that pause had a particular quality. I have sat through difficult silences before, waiting for weapon lock warnings that didn't come, waiting for drive diagnostics that took longer than they should have, waiting in a patrol approach corridor for an all-clear signal that arrived 40 minutes late. But the silence of the recognition pause was different. It was the silence of something very large in the process of changing its mind. The Vraathi High Docent had 40 years of files on humanity. Those files were, in this moment, actively incomplete, and he knew it, and the reclassification was happening in real time, with all 18 warships holding discipline in the dark, while the man at the top of the Vraathi hierarchy worked through what to do with information his doctrine had not anticipated. I found in that silence that I respected it, not because I was supposed to find the conclave admirable, my loyalty was appropriately placed, but because there is a kind of discipline that deserves acknowledgement regardless of which side of a contact it is exercised on. The High Docent held his fleet in place and thought rather than reacted. That is not a small thing. That is the difference between a dangerous adversary and a merely powerful one. At 12:04 hours, 51 minutes after the liturgical period expired, the Vraathi transmitted on the standard diplomatic band, not the liturgical band. The standard band in trade lingua, which was the common language of the outer arm and required no ceremony, no glyph disc, no prescribed interval. 3 words. "We hear you." Akafer looked at me. I looked at Dahl. Dahl had not changed expression. "That's not the invitation signal," Akafor said. No, Dal agreed. It's not in the liturgy at all. No, a pause. Transmit a return acknowledgement on the same band. Standard diplomatic format, keep it simple. Akafor nodded to Solis. Solis prepared the acknowledgement. What should the text be, Ambassador? Solis asked. Akafor thought. She was a woman who had spent 40 years in rooms where the wrong word cost lives, and she stood in front of a sensor console in the shadow of a gas giant, and chose her word with the care of someone who understood exactly how much was riding on it. We are here, she said. Solis encoded and transmitted. A silence of approximately 90 seconds. Then the Vraathi transmitted again. We ask that the large vessel be still. I looked at Solis. The Karev hasn't moved. She hasn't, stationary since drive startup. Dal considered this for a moment. The Vraathi were asking for something that had already been given. The request was not operational. It was not a demand that the Karev stop doing something. It was a statement about the nature of the exchange. They were asking for a thing they had been given, and they knew they had been given it, and the act of asking was itself the communication. They were saying, we understand that you can choose to be still, and we are asking you to choose it in our presence, as a declaration of intent rather than a constraint. Dal looked at Akafor. The large vessel is still, Akafor said. That is the response, exactly that. Solis transmitted. A silence of 6 minutes and 40 seconds. I logged every second of it. Then the Vraathi transmitted again, 12 lines of trade lingua in formal high-register construction. The kind of language the Vraathi used for communications intended to enter the permanent record. Akafor read it aloud. The Vraathi Conclave, through its high-docent Sothran Vra Althu of the Third Accord, acknowledges the presence of the Terran Expeditionary Survey Diplomatic Vessel Catalog Designation Lisbon, and the vessel in whose shadow it traveled. The Conclave recognizes that both vessels have maintained the liturgical approach with full correctness, and that the larger vessel's silence was itself a form of liturgical observance, the nature of which the Conclave had not previously encountered and does not yet fully understand. The Conclave does not withdraw. The Conclave requests the continuation of the contact at a pace and form to be agreed. The Conclave acknowledges that it approaches this continuation with corrected understanding. She lowered the transcript. The bridge was quiet. Corrected understanding, Dal said. It's a formal phrase. In the Vraathi framework, it means they have updated their doctrine, not abandoned it, updated it. They have taken what they've seen and filed it into the record, and the record now says something different than it said before. What does the record say now? Akafor thought carefully. I believe it says humanity is a thing that can be still. For a predator-evolved species, stillness is a measure of threat. You are only still if you don't need to move. You are only still if you already know the outcome. The Conclave came here expecting to be the stillest thing in the room. She folded the transcript carefully. They weren't. She looked at the forward screen. 18 Vraathi warships holding their widened Vraathi Kellen. The Vraathi arrays steady in that compressed violet, the double pulse gone now, just held, watching. Dal authorized the formal response. Solis transmitted. The high docent's acknowledgement came back in 90 seconds. The Sothran would be dissolved and replaced with the Vraathi Sova, the conference formation. Smaller, slower, an armada explicitly choosing to reduce its tactical profile in exchange for a closer meeting. In the entire documented history of Vraathi first contacts, this had never happened. The Conclave had never moved from Sothran directly to Vraathi Sova at the first exchange. That single fact, confirmed for me later by Akafor, is not a footnote. It is the measure of what the recognition pause had produced. The 18 warships began to move. There is a footnote to this moment that I have not spoken publicly, and I include it here because it belongs in the precise record. At 12:07 hours, while Akafor was composing the formal diplomatic response, I stepped away from the bridge to the small communications alcove where we had a secondary terminal. I pulled up the Karev's transponder data, not the full operational record, but the basic navigational log any officer with XO clearance could access. I wanted to know when she had arrived. The log showed that the TES Karev, Vraathi-class DN7, had entered the UVETH system 63 days, 7 hours, and 14 minutes before the moment her drives lit. 63 days. In a 2-kilometer dreadnought, 800 meters from where we had been told to hold for our liturgical period. 1,140 people at minimum power, in cold cloak, holding still in the dark while a diplomatic frigate did the first steps of contact. Because the doctrine required it, because the moment required it, because someone at Fleet Command had read the Vraathi liturgy closely enough to understand that what you bring to this kind of meeting is not only the weapon. It is the patience. I stood in the communications alcove for a long moment, reading the log entry. Then I went back to the bridge. Dahl was at the main console. Akafer handed her the completed formal response for authorization. Dahl looked up when I came in, read my face. She was very good at reading faces and said nothing. She signed the response and handed it back to Akafer. Transmit when ready, Ambassador. The formal contact lasted 11 days. I will not write a detailed account here because it belongs to Akafer's record, which she filed with complete precision. What I will say is this. The high docent Sothran Vraathi was a precise and careful intellect. In 11 days of exchange, he asked approximately 400 questions. Many were about doctrine. Some were about drive specifications. Several were about the Vraathi-class mass driver battery, which Captain Essendon answered through a liaison channel with the same measured flatness he apparently used for everything. There was no posturing in those exchanges, no gloating, no demonstrations, no demands. Essendon answered what was asked. Althu catalogued what he was told. It was a conversation between two very serious people updating their respective files, and both of them were doing the work with care. The sessions ran in 2-hour blocks, twice daily. Between sessions, Akafer and her attachés prepared materials and reviewed transcripts for anything needing clarification. I ran the ship's normal routine, monitored the Karev's position, and drank more bad coffee. The conference formation maintained its agreed position throughout, close enough for real-time communication, far enough that neither side was inside the other's minimum response distance. I attended most of the formal sessions in a listening capacity, not as a participant, but as a second set of ears for Dahl, who could not be in the contact compartment and on the bridge simultaneously, and had decided the bridge was where she needed to be. I sat in the corner of the contact compartment with a tablet and took my own notes alongside the official transcript, noting not just what was said but the intervals between transmissions, the register shifts in Althu's language, the points where he asked a follow-up question instead of moving to the next item. Those patterns told a different story than the words alone. The intervals between Althu's responses were not random. They were the pauses of a careful thinker who was filing each piece of new information into a structure before asking for the next piece. He was not gathering data. He was building architecture. On the 6th day, he asked about the command structure of the larger vessel, not the weapons, not the drive configuration, but who held authority over it and how that authority had been conveyed for a mission of this particular type. What he was asking, I understood later, was something subtler than an order of battle. He was asking who had decided that the larger vessel would remain silent when it could have spoken, who had made the choice that 63 days of silence was the correct choice, and on what authority, and what did that say about the relationship between the vessel that spoke and the vessel that did not. Akafer transmitted the answer carefully. Fleet Command had made the operational decision. Both vessels understood their roles. Althu's response came after a longer pause than usual, nearly 6 minutes. Then, and the smaller vessel's crew accepted their role without knowledge of the larger vessel's presence. Yes, Akafor transmitted, they did. Another pause. Then, this requires a particular kind of trust. It does, Akafor transmitted. The session ended there, as if the high docent had reached the thing he was looking for and needed time to file it correctly before continuing. On the fourth day of formal contact, the high docent asked the question I returned to most often. He asked it in high register formal construction, the kind reserved for permanent record entries. How long had the large vessel been waiting before it was seen? Akafor transmitted the answer, 63 days, 7 hours, 14 minutes. There was a silence on the channel of approximately 4 minutes and 20 seconds. I logged the silence. Then the high docent transmitted a single phrase in the old liturgical script, the script used in the Book of the Deep Passage, and Akafor looked at the transcript for a long time before she translated it for us. The phrase was Vraathi Conclave. The moment a thing changes its nature without changing its course. On the 8th day, Althu asked a second question. He asked it in the informal register he had begun using toward the middle of the contact period, which Akafor had told me was a positive indicator. The Vraathi used informal register when confident they were not being deceived. The question was the smaller vessel aware that the large vessel was present? Akafor looked at Dahl. Dahl looked at me. I thought about 11 weeks of genuine belief that we were 41 people alone in the deep. No, Akafor transmitted. The smaller vessel's crew was not informed. A silence of perhaps 2 minutes. Then the high docent transmitted, I understand. Akafor told me later that in the old liturgical framework, the phrase I understand carried specific weight when used in response to information about an action taken by a larger party in relation to a smaller one. It was not simple acknowledgement. It was closer to what a human might mean by, now I know what you value. What Althu now knew humanity valued was this, that the vessel which spoke first should speak honestly without knowledge of the weapon behind it, that the weapon would be present regardless, that humanity saw no contradiction between these two things, that the silence of the larger vessel and the genuine unawareness of the smaller one's crew were both part of the same message, and the message was, this is what we are, not just the capability, not just the scale. The patience, the discipline, the willingness to let the moment be what the moment required rather than what ambition might prefer. The formal contact ended on the 11th day with the issuance of the corrected understanding accord, not a treaty, but a formal doctrinal statement entered into the permanent record of both parties, acknowledging that the contact had occurred, that the conclave's prior assessment of humanity's strategic profile had been incomplete, and that future interactions would proceed on the basis of updated doctrine. No binding commitments, no enforcement mechanism. What it had was wait. In the Vraathi framework, a doctrinal correction entered into the permanent record was irrevocable. You could not unknow something that was in the record. The high docent had taken the site of the Karev, and the 63 days, and the answer about the smaller vessel's crew not knowing, and he had filed all of it into the record, and the record would carry it forward into every future exchange. The Sothran never reassembled. The conference formation held through the full formal farewell sequence, 3 more hours of liturgical ceremony, correctly performed, nothing improvised, nothing added, and then the 18 ships withdrew toward their own space in good order. We watched them go on the forward screen, all 41 of us on the bridge or listening over the ship's channel. When the last contact dropped below resolution threshold, Dahl said quietly, "That will do." Then she stood up from her chair, which I had never seen her do at a watch end, and went to the galley. I followed her. She had managed to make a passable cup from the machine, which she claimed was about calibration, and which I continued to believe was about luck, and she was standing at the port window looking out at the space where the Vraathi formation had been. The Karev was visible at distance now, running lights on, her enormous hull catching the gas giant's amber warmth in slow strips as she turned on station. 63 days, Dahl said without turning. Yes, I said. A quiet moment. Essenden's a patient man. It seems so. 1,140 people. Yes. She drank her coffee. Outside, the Karev held position against the amber dark, vast and completely at rest. I thought about Essenden. I had never met him and would not until the debrief at Uveth Station, 17 days later, when the after-action review brought the Lisbon's officers and the Karev's senior staff into the same conference room for the first time. He was a tall man, thin, with the quality of economy that some people develop after long time in command. Movements and words reduced to the minimum necessary, nothing wasted. He had commanding officers' insignia that looked as if they had been worn so long they had become part of the uniform, rather than attached to it. He drank his coffee black and sat through the debrief with the same stillness he had apparently maintained for 63 days in the dark. When the review board asked him to characterize the decision to power up the drives rather than maintain cloak through the full formal contact period, he said that he had calculated the moment the Vraathi acoustic analog array would have reached sufficient sensitivity to read the Karev's cold drive signature through the interference node, and that he had determined it was preferable to reveal on his own terms than to be revealed on theirs. He said this without emphasis. He said it the way you state a fact that has already been entered into the record and requires no embellishment. The board asked whether he had considered revealing earlier or waiting longer. Essenden thought for 2 seconds. Then he said, earlier would have been before the recognition pause, which would have been noise rather than signal. Later would have been after the invitation signal, which would have been too late to matter. I noted that answer in my own record beside the official transcripts. 63 days, and the calculation of a precise window inside them. That was the patience. Not the waiting alone. The waiting was simply the mechanism. The patience was the understanding that there was a right moment and that it would be identifiable when it arrived, and the discipline to hold everything in place until that moment came. I thought about rivers, about what a river looks like from above, the way its surface seems calm when you are far enough up, how that stillness conceals the depth and the current and the age of the thing, how you can stand on a bank and think you understand a river because you can see the water moving, and how different it looks when you rise high enough to see the whole of it, where it comes from, how far it has traveled, the thousands of kilometers of silent passage through every terrain it has cut through before it arrives at the place where you are standing. The Vraathi had spent 40 years reading the edge of humanity's reach. They had read the diplomatic pulses, the silent Sandeco responses, the modest mass profile of the vessel we sent to meet them. They had read a tributary. The Karev was the river. Not because of the weapons, though she carried them. Not because she could have destroyed the formation, though she could. Because she had been there for 63 days without needing to announce herself. Because the doctrine that sent her, and the patience of 1,140 people holding her still in the dark, and the calculation of a fleet command that understood the right moment was not the first moment. All of it was the river, moving in silence, cutting its channel through the dark, arriving exactly where it needed to be, exactly when the conclave was ready to see it. There is a kind of strength that announces itself, and a kind of strength that does not. The strength that announces itself is easy to read, easy to plan against, easy to build a doctrine for. You can see it coming. You can calculate the trajectory. You can prepare. The strength that does not announce itself is the harder thing. It requires the patience to remain unknown until the moment is right. It requires the discipline to hold 1,140 people in cold silence for 63 days while a smaller ship does the talking. It requires the willingness to let someone else be seen, so that you are seen at the right moment rather than the first. Humanity had been building that second kind of strength for a long time, longer than the Vraathi had been watching, longer than any of their files recorded. The Karev had been in the dark before any of the Conclave's sensors were pointed at us. She had been in the dark while 11 weeks of liturgical approach played out. She had been in the dark at the moment the High Docent transmitted his formal Sothran acknowledgement and believed he was looking at the whole of what we were. He was looking at 41 people in a 14,000-ton frigate. He was looking at the tributary. He had not yet seen the river. I stood at the port window with my bad coffee and watched the Karev hold position in the amber light, enormous and at rest. I thought about the High Docent at his station aboard the Vraathi, working through his reclassification with the discipline of 40 years of careful practice, filing what he had seen into the permanent record, updating the doctrine. I hoped he had found the right words for it. In all the vast architecture of the Vraathi liturgy, with its precise terminology for the behavior of rivers and predators and fleets, I hoped there was a word already waiting for what he had seen, or that he found one, a word for the silence of a patient thing in the dark, a word for the specific shape of the message that two vessels had sent together without either one's crew knowing the other was there. He did find the word. It was already in the oldest texts, as I learned later. It was Vraathi. The moment a thing changes its nature without changing its course. The coffee was still bad. It always was. I finished the watch. I logged my end-of-watch report with the same flat language I always used. Then I went to my bunk and I thought about rivers and about the moment a thing changes its nature without changing its course, and I slept better than I had in 11 weeks.